Good evening and welcome to Tucker Carlson Tonight. A remarkable amount of news today for a Friday in July. Dan Bongino joins us in just a moment to go through it. Later, we'll also talk to the most prominent Democratic socialist in America, Cornel West, about how his movement, which is growing fast, seeks to change this country. But first tonight, according to investigative journalist John Solomon, writing at the Hill newspaper, new memos conclusively show a systematic effort by FBI officials to cripple the Trump campaign and later the Trump administration. These memos, which were unearthed during recent oversight investigations, reveal politically inflamed FBI employees, activists basically, working to accelerate an investigation into Donald Trump before Election Day, apparently hoping to influence the outcome of the election. At the heart of this effort, you guessed it, disgraced official Peter Strzok, who led the Russia investigation from the beginning and later promised his girlfriend Lisa Page that they would be able to, quote, stop Trump. They did their best. In September 2016, for example, Trump advisor Carter Page wrote a letter to the director of the FBI, Jim Comey, complaining about what he said were false leaks about him. Strzok's reaction to Page's letter, quote, at a minimum, he texted his girlfriend, this letter provides us a pretext to interview Carter Page. A pretext, in other words, an excuse. In another memo, 4 weeks before Election Day, Strzok tells Page he is placing the, quote, hurry the F up pressure on Andy McCabe to get a FISA warrant to spy on Carter Page. Even after the election, they didn't stop. In one email, Strzok discusses the need to share any potential, quote, derogatory information the FBI might have gleaned from confidential informants. Keep in mind, these are the same people, Strzok and Page, who wound up as members of the Mueller investigation. There's no defending any of this, and yet the left is. Carter Page has been on the receiving end of all this for years now, and he joins us tonight. Carter Page, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Tucker.
So let's go back on the timeline to the letter that you sent to Jim Comey, then director of the FBI, about the leaks against you. What were those leaks?
Well, I sent that on Sunday, September 25th, 2016. 2 days before that, on the Friday, the September 23rd, there was a big defamatory article put out by a Yahoo News. And, you know, as we subsequently learned from the House intelligence memos, that was part of this fake news article was actually used as part of the FISA application. So completely outrageous. Carter,
I'm having a little trouble with my audio. I'm pretty certain that our audience can hear you just fine. So just clarify for us the basics here. You have not, after all of this, and you've been under surveillance, in effect, under investigation for years now. You haven't been charged with anything. Do you expect that you're going to be charged with anything after all of this?
Tucker, I couldn't even imagine anything that I could potentially be charged with. It's just, you know, particularly after seeing John Solomon's article today, it just becomes, you know, the whole, you know, using the term from that quote you had, pretext. The pretext was absolutely outrageous, ridiculous. And so, you know, this is pretext wrapped upon pretext. It's completely out of control. So I can't even imagine what I would be charged with.
Do you know, after, again, all of this, what exactly the suspected crime was? You were the subject of a FISA warrant, the federal government turning its awesome surveillance powers on you. That's a big deal. We have a whole court system designed to keep that from being abused. Why would the federal government want to read your emails and spy on you in ways we may not even know about? What did they think you were doing exactly?
Well, I think, as we learned with the first Inspector General report from a couple of weeks ago, I call it Inspector IG Report 1.0, you know, there's a lot of political motivations behind what was happening earlier in the presidential election campaigns. And I think what is a lot of evidence that has come out both from House Intelligence Committee, Senate Judiciary Committee, House Judiciary, as well as others, there was a lot of abuses going on. So, you know, I think it's completely political. There's nothing substantive to this whatsoever.
Well, presumably, if there were something substantive, you'd be charged with a felony, right? So this is not the behavior of a free country,
yes,
of an open, legitimate government spying on its own citizens for political reasons. What does this cost you financially?
Tucker, I'm not, it's like President Trump said during the campaign, it's not about me, it's about us. I'm not concerned, it's cost me tremendously. It's cost many people in the Trump movement, the people I was volunteering with, tremendously in terms of, all the legal fees and challenges it's created in many ways to their lives. In some cases, a lot of terrorist threats. The bigger issue is the obstruction in terms of U.S. foreign policy, the terrible impact that this had on possibilities in terms of U.S.-Russia relations, creating a better pathway for the world that President Trump was talking about during the campaign. And so I'm hoping there's going to be a lot more of this. This is just the tip of the iceberg, I think, what we've seen here. A lot more coming out over the weeks to come. But a bigger thing is coming in with the Helsinki summit, and I'm hoping that the quicker that the truth comes out, the more they'll be able to chart a better course for the future of our country. So
we will be at the Helsinki summit,
awesome.
And I look forward to that. Carter Page, thanks very much.
Thanks, Tucker.
Chris Hahn is a radio show host. He's a former staffer to Senator Chuck Schumer of New York, and he joins us tonight. There you have it, Chris. I wanted to talk to Carter Page, not because we're personal friends or I have any vested interest in his story or his life, but because I'm an American, and I think the civil liberties of every American matter. Here you have a guy who clearly didn't commit a crime, whose life has been completely destroyed by the FBI and the Obama administration. You can't look at that and not, as an American, feel outraged. And yet the left is totally fine with what's happened to Carter Page. Why is that, do you think?
Well, I don't think anybody's fine with civil liberties being violated, and I don't know that his actually have. I mean, the man did take the fifth for a lot of questions when he went to that closed door session with Congress.
Oh, is that a constitutional right? Wait, hold on, wait a second. So if you take the fifth, you don't have civil liberties? What are you taking the fifth is a civil liberty?
No,
what law school did you go to?
Oh, hold on a minute. Hold on a minute. I went to St. John's, and I'm proud of that. But let me just also say that the President of the United States once said, if they take the fifth, it means they're guilty.
I don't care what Trump said. I'm an American citizen, and you have a right not to testify under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution, the Bill of Rights. And by the way, you have a right not to be spied upon for political reasons. And my question is, why was Carter Page the subject of a FISA warrant after the FBI had already looked exhaustively into his interactions with the Russians? They clearly abused his civil liberties, and nobody cares because he volunteered for Donald Trump. That is police state stuff, and civil libertarians of all stripes ought to be upset about it.
Remember, the man started by providing documents to a Russian spy in 2014. That's
what were those
how
documents?
They start to recruit
what were,
you. Then
what were
the
those,
man.
Wait, hold on. You just accused him of. Oh, you don't know what they are.
It is widely known, and he will admit that he gave documents to a Russian spy.
Well, what documents? Was it a pizza menu, or was it the blueprints to a thermonuclear warhead? I mean,
this is how they start to recruit you. They ask you to provide them with something which is legal, and they show that you will actually do it. This was a Russian spy attempting to recruit him. That Russian spy was later indicted and convicted, and this came up in that.
Did the Russian spy shows
up on a presidential campaign? The FBI was right to start looking into it.
But wait,
absolutely right.
They were. So they already knew that the documents that you attempted to make sound so sinister amounted to nothing, that Carter Page was not in fact spying for the Russian government, that he was not a mole. They knew that. They knew that, and yet they got a FISA warrant against him already. Don't you think that the U.S. government, for its spies on its own citizens, ought to have a good reason, and that reason shouldn't be made up by a political activist like Peter Strzok or his girlfriend, Lisa Page?
So the fact that he'd been communicating with senior Russian officials, including members of their spy rings in Russia, and then he goes to Russia with the permission of Corey Lewandowski. He goes to Russia in 2016 during the campaign. I think the FBI would be suspicious, and I think that they should have been suspicious.
What?
And they should look into it.
Since you've raised this allegation, we have actually Carter Page in the studio. I want to ask him what these documents were And I mean, let's get very specific here. You passed documents to a Russian spy. Did you betray your country? What were the documents? And why aren't you in prison right now if that was a felony?
Tucker, this is complete spin. I was teaching a course at New York University called Energy in the World in the spring semester of 2013, and I had a coffee with a diplomat from the Russian consulate, and I showed him.
Who was a spy?
I showed him a couple of
he was
of
a spy.
The course materials from my
you gave
academic
him documents
course.
that he requested.
But wait, hold on,
from
wait, Chris,
before you
impugn, wait, slow down. Before you impugn, hold on. Before you impugn his patriotism as an American, shouldn't you hear what the documents were? Wouldn't that inform your judgment?
Public information, yes.
The documents, that was a course description. Do you think if you passed, Chris Hahn, a course description for a public university course to a foreigner who you didn't know was a spy, would you be betraying your country if you did that?
I tend not to hang out with Russian spies because I'm trying to get a gas deal with their nationally owned gas syndicate.
So do you think that there is something unpatriotic? So you think there's something
tend to love this country?
So you're saying that Carter Page doesn't love his country? Carter Page, where'd you go to college, by the way?
Look,
U.S. Naval Academy.
Oh, you went to the U.S. Naval Academy. So you're accusing him, Chris, of being unpatriotic. This man graduated from Annapolis and was a naval officer, but he's unpatriotic. He doesn't love his country. Is that what you're saying?
I don't know what's in his heart. I have read the files on you, Carter, and I hope that you are a good person, and I hope that if you are a good person, all of this goes away from you. But from what I read, it is something that I would be concerned about if I was the FBI and you were on a presidential campaign. I would be worried that the Russians would be infiltrating that campaign. And I think you yourself,
really quick,
Carter Page, as an expert in this, would agree with that.
Do you love your country, Carter Page?
I love my country, and actually all of my actions directly speak to that. And I think, you know, President Trump and his initiatives in terms of building a better structure for, you know, international relations, particularly U.S.-Russia relations, I think is going to show great love for the country.
Yeah.
And actually,
I love my country. I'm embarrassed to live here right now. This is a shameful moment in our country's history that we would do this to one of our citizens.
A great code word in the in that document from John Solomon today. They use the term, there's a new code word, dragon, right? And that reminded me of Dragon Energy, you know, that Kanye West was talking about. We're both Dragon Energy. President Trump's my brother. I love everyone. It's this very positive approach, trying to create a better world for all American citizens and, you know, better peaceful situation in the world versus, you know, I think what we heard from Mr. Hahn of just tearing people down, you know. And I think the funny part about it is going back to the dodgy dossier, they were pulling these same you know, falsehoods for.
You know, I don't really know about the dragon stuff, but you don't seem like a spy to me. I'm being told we're out of time. Gentlemen, thank you both. Whoa. Dan Bongino has served his country as well. He's a former Secret Service agent, now an NRA TV contributor, and he joins us now. Do you love your country, Dan? By the way, did you ever think, we're about the same age, did you ever think we'd get to a place where the McCarthy era sort of restarted again, but with a different cast, where people were accusing one another of not loving their country because they gave a college syllabus to somebody who turns out to be working for the Foreign Intelligence Service without even the knowledge of the person who gave the syllabus? Like, what is going on?
It's a disgrace, Tucker. This is a stain on our country, what's going on right now. What happened to the civil libertarian left? I mean, Alan Dershowitz can't even go to a dinner party in Martha's Vineyard, apparently, without being threatened. A liberal, by the way, Alan Dershowitz, because he's asking the questions you and I have been asking for months. Where's the crime? Where's the crime?
I know.
There is no probable cause a crime was committed. Carter Page is on your television show. If this guy's the greatest kingpin of a spy operation we've seen in modern American history, why is he out there free? Well, maybe you got the story wrong. Has that ever occurred to people in the media?
Well, I'm not even sure what Carter Page is saying some of the time, but he's clearly not betraying his country. He's an Annapolis graduate. And to accuse him of espionage and spy on him with no evidence whatsoever is really shameful behavior. I don't know, will there be a point, I don't want to ask you to prognosticate, where the left wakes up and says, we're abetting, you know, something that's really dark and wrong, and we should not do this. We should return to our commitment to civil liberties.
No. because they're not investigating a crime, and the left is not looking for a crime. What they're looking for is the scalp of Donald Trump, Tucker. They're not looking for a crime here. There is no crime. Tucker, that Solomon piece today in The Hill is devastating. At one point it says, get a load of this, they went after Carter Page. Their FBI read the media reports they leaked. They then used the media reports Carter Page complained about as an excuse to go interview Carter Page. That's in the report today. Well, I mean, is this a third world country? Are they kidding?
It sure seems like it. And it's not about Trump. It's not about Carter Page. It's about America and betraying its most basic values, which they are doing. Dan Bongino, thank you.
Yes, sir.
Democratic socialists, they are everywhere. The head of the Democratic Party says they're the future. So what is democratic socialism exactly? We've got one of the most celebrated leaders of that movement, Cornel West, joining us right after the break. You've heard the phrase a lot lately, democratic socialist. It's suddenly very common on the left. Bernie Sanders has called himself a democratic socialist. So has New York congressional candidate Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. She's the woman that the DNC chair, Tom Perez, recently said this about.
She represents the future of our party. Alexandria's victory was just a remarkable reminder of the depth that we have in the Democratic Party.
Okay, so democratic socialism is the future, but what is democratic socialism? We thought it'd be worth pausing for a minute to find out. Democratic socialism is not, by the way, a wing of the Democratic Party, at least not yet. It's an entirely separate movement with its own national organization, the Democratic Socialists of America. 2 years ago, the DSA endorsed Bernie Sanders and opposed Donald Trump, but did not endorse Hillary Clinton. So at times, it has been antagonistic to the Democratic Party. What did democratic socialists believe? There's no formal platform, but the outlines are pretty clear. Democratic socialists support socialism, state ownership of major industries. That would include healthcare, technology, manufacturing. Some of them explicitly support communism. The co-chair of Portland, Oregon's chapter of the DSA recently tweeted this, quote, as a DSA chapter co-chair, I just want to set the record straight for a minute. Communism is good. But democratic socialism is about more than economics. The DSA's official Twitter account demands reparations for African Americans in the form of free and open enrollment at public colleges, retroactive forgiveness of student loans, and a guaranteed lifetime minimum income. The DSA has also called for an end to all immigrant deportations everywhere in the United States. In New York, the DSA has demanded the abolition of profits, prisons, cash bail, and borders. Not all democratic socialists have the same views on everything, but that gives you some idea. Unlimited, uncontrolled immigration into the U.S., coupled with race-based reparations, the abolition of prisons, and by extension, law and order itself, and a massive expansion of the welfare state financed by an economic system that does not recognize profit. How would that work exactly? Has it ever worked in any country in the world? Those suddenly seem like relevant questions. At this pace, a democratic socialist could get the Democratic nomination at some point and be elected president. So we thought it was a perfect moment to speak to possibly the most famous of all advocates for democratic socialism, Cornel West. He's a professor at Harvard. He's an honorary co-chair of the Democratic Socialists of America, and he joins us tonight. Cornel, thank you for coming on.
No, thank you, and it's good to be in dialogue with you once again, brother.
Yes, it is. So to give us some sense of what democratic socialism is, can you point to an example, an extant example of it that works? Venezuela seems like an example of democratic socialism. Would you say that it is? And if so, does it work?
No, I don't think that democratic socialism as an ideal has been able to be embodied in a larger social context. There's different forms of it. Some are bad, some are medium, some are better. But the fundamental commitment is to the dignity of ordinary people and to make sure they can live lives of decency. So it's not an ism, no, brother. It's about decency. It's about fairness. Right. It's about the accountability of the powerful vis-a-vis those who have less power. At the workplace, women dealing with the household, gays, lesbians, trans, black people, indigenous peoples, immigrants. How do we ensure that they are treated decently and that the powerful don't in any way manipulate, subjugate, and exploit them?
Well, I mean, if that's what democratic socialism is, then I'm basically on board. I do think that ordinary people, middle-class people, ought to have dignity. And I think that our current systems make it hard for them to have dignity. So I agree with all of that. But the details
and that's
matter.
precisely why. That's why Albert Einstein, Helen Keller, Norman Thomas, Eugene Debs, Martin Luther King Jr., Ella Baker. We can go on and on. They're all democratic socialists. Michael Harrington, one of the great founders of Democratic Socialists of America. I've been a member for 36 years.
I understand, but has it struck you as interesting that it's never actually worked anywhere? So the question is not what are our goals. Our goals are the same. How do we get there is the question. So what happened in Venezuela? They call that democratic socialism, but they don't have toilet paper, and it's less equal than ever.
But part of the problem is, though, brothers, that any time there's been the attempts of ordinary people to engage in self-determination, they can get crushed by external nations. Look at U.S. policies toward Venezuela has been very, very ugly. Nicaragua in the same way. We saw that in so many other instances where countries tried to engage in self-determination and they either get crushed, they either get coerced, and they end up oftentimes responding to that kind of authoritarian treatment. So we've never had a chance to really pull it off. So it's only been a movement so far. It's an attempt to resist the greed at the top, the racism, the sexism, the homophobia, the various ways in which humanity is violated rather than affirmed.
So here's just to the details quickly. The DSA of New York, which is certainly one of the biggest in the country, recently said...
And thank God for Sister Alexandria. She's my dear sister and comrade. Absolutely.
So they said that they're against borders, profits, and prisons. What would a country without prisons look like? What would you do with murderers, for example, or rapists? Where would you put them with no prisons?
Well, I mean, when they say prisons, they're talking about the kinds of prisons we have at the present. If you have sites of rehabilitation, education, ways in which transformation can take place, you and I ourselves, you're Episcopalian, I'm Baptist. We're Christians, right? We believe all human beings made not just an image of God, but they can be changed, they can be transformed when the right kind of intervention takes place. That's what people mean in the socialist movement when they talk about the elimination of the kind of prisons that are in place.
So what they really mean is better prisons.
And
maybe they should be more... Okay, so what about borders, though?
You can have isolation, you can have distance, but you don't give up on them. And most importantly, you don't view them in a vicious, through the lens of being less than human, that they can bounce back, they can be better.
So if a government's obligation is to its own citizens, and you drop the borders and have no border enforcement at all, what would happen to this country? What would happen to the poor people in this country? Would their lives get better? Would they become more prosperous? No. This country would become poorer, dirtier, impossible to manage. It would be flooded with the poor of the world, and it would destroy our country instantly. So why would you say no borders?
Well, I mean, again, no, you got a variety of voices in the Democratic Socialists of America. We like a jazz orchestra. You got different perspectives and orientations. We all don't agree on one particular policy all the time. This is true in terms of Israeli occupation of Palestinians. Some are in the middle, some are much more critical, like myself. The question is, how do you keep track of the rich humanity of Mexican brothers and sisters, of those coming from Latin America, those coming from Africa, those coming from Haiti, and those coming from Europe and Asia? That's the important thing. We know the history of America, other than indigenous peoples and Africans who've been enslaved, was to open the borders, to bring folk in, to allow people to gain access. But it's not a matter of no borders at all. It's a matter of how do you ensure that their dignity is affirmed when they arrive so that you don't end up having the kind of neo-fascist policies of the Trump administration separating these precious children from their mothers and fathers.
That's silly, as you well know. But how do you think that the descendants of Americans... But hold on. How do you think the descendants of American slaves benefit when you bring in 25 million illegal immigrants from the third world? Does that elevate poor Americans? I don't see any evidence that they get richer or happier when you bring in more poor people. You ignore their problems. That's why we don't pay any attention to their problems anymore.
My dear brother, but if we were having this discussion 100 years ago and you had millions of people coming from Jew-hating Europe, Irish-hating Britain, and Ireland, I mean, all the folk who came into the making of slices of this nation, did it not allow for the kind of coming together in which poor and working people would be able to straighten their backs up and speak with dignity? and decency about issues that affect all of us. That's the history of the nation, with the exception of the African slaves and the precious indigenous peoples. So the idea that somehow now that the immigrants are here, and a lot of the immigrants who've only been here 1 or 2 generations now become the definitive authority defining what it is to be an American. How hypocritical can you get? I've been here 9 generations coming out of enslaved people, and I can still embrace my Mexican brothers and sisters. I can embrace a whole host of others coming from around the world. But it's not just a matter of no borders. I don't believe in just no borders myself. It's a question of making sure their dignity is affirmed when they get here.
Then you got to get a hold of the DSA of New York's Twitter account, because they're saying some pretty reckless
we got a number of voices in DSA. I love them. We believe in disagreement. We believe in disagreement. You were just talking about disagreement in terms of defending civil liberties. I believe in protecting civil liberties. Yours, mine, Page's, Bernie Sanders, Mumia Abu-Jamal's, a whole host of folk. But we have to be consistent. It can't just be right-wing.
You always lose me at the end, Cornell. Thank you so much for coming on. I hope you will come back. Cornell West. Well, the woman who shut down the Statue of Liberty on July 4th recently credited Michelle Obama for what she did. We'll show you that and more next. Statue of Liberty on July 4th. You'd think she would be regarded as a villain. She's now regarded as a hero on the left. Yesterday, she pleaded guilty to federal trespassing and disorderly conduct charges. She walked out of the courthouse wearing a "White Supremacy is Terrorism" T-shirt, and then said this to a crowd of supporters.
Michelle Obama, our beloved First Lady that I care so much about, said when they go low, we go high, and I went as high as I could. Trump has wrecked this country apart. It is depressing. It is outrageous. I can say a lot of things about this monster. Only a stupid, unintelligent, coward, and insecure, I will add a maniac, will whip a tender-aged child from its mother.
Imagine you're coming from Congo, which is one of the worst countries in the world. Probably not a lot of nice people there, but a bad country. You come to the United States, you get this new home given to you by the people of the United States, and you show up and you were not grateful at all. And instead you were denouncing the country and its leader as racist, white supremacist monsters. That's heroism on the left, apparently. Well, the American economy has been steadily improving this year, but recent headlines are warning of catastrophe. This from CNBC. The U.S. labor shortage is reaching a critical point, it says. Here's the Wall Street Journal, quote, America's worker shortage. Well, it's not hard to tell what these labor shortage pieces are trying to imply. An opinion piece in the Hill newspaper makes it obvious, quote, immigration is the best solution for a shortage of workers in America. That's a crock. Big businesses want to import more workers because it lets them keep wages low, labor costs down. Without immigration, there's only one solution to a so-called labor shortage: raise wages. Do more training of Americans. Take a chance on marginal workers, disabled workers, those with a criminal record, the exact ones the left is always telling you they care about. It would be great if that happened. There are about 7 million American men in this country between 25 and 54, prime working age. They're unemployed or out of the labor force entirely. Many of them have stopped looking for work during the Great Recession. They are not counted in the unemployment numbers. And yet each one is a living disaster. The tight labor market is exactly what we could use to get all of these, or many of them, back to work. Hiring Americans, by the way, is the fastest way to reduce poverty, strengthen families, reverse the decline of men, cut crime, restore dignity to rural America, and in general make this a better country. Some businesses don't want to bother to do that. It's easier to import new workers. Tough. Stephen Camarata is Director of Research at the Center for Immigration Studies, and he joins us tonight. How offensive is it to you as an American to read, with 7 million prime-age men out of the workforce, that we have a labor shortage, and so we need to import more low-wage labor?
Right. Now, that's just the high school dropouts. If we look at people without a high school education, there are about 40 million people in the United States between 18 and 65 who have no education, don't have a college education, who are currently out of the workforce. They don't show up in statistics. And that's several million more than it was at the peak of the last economic expansion. There's just no evidence of a labor shortage in America.
So it's just the opposite, actually. There's a huge pool of people who are languishing without meaningful work, And businesses, rather than try and do something, or our leaders, rather than try to improve public schools, for example, just find it much easier to import a new surf class.
Look, absolutely. Look, we can look at wages as another measure, right? If labor was really in tight supply, we would expect wages to be rising. But we can look at wages for high school dropouts, people with only a high school education, or people with some college. Over the last decade, their wages are either stagnant or actually declined once you adjust for inflation. Again, no evidence of a labor shortage there. And yet we always worry about the working poor. We worry about income inequality. We worry about work not paying, people just dropping out and living on welfare. And yet now we have an opportunity to see wages rise, and yet the business community and allies in both parties are clamoring to short circuit all that and bring in as many immigrant workers as they can.
So you wonder why socialism, which is a disaster, is suddenly so popular with young people. It's because wages are low and they can't afford to buy a house or get married. You would think the left would notice this. They were always historically on the side of workers and higher wages. They don't care.
Yeah, at this point, the idea is that they just don't want to look at this question. They say, well, look, we'll increase minimum wage, we'll have unions, we'll have income transfers, more welfare, things like that. Whatever you think of the merits of those policies, why isn't a tight labor market one of the best things we can do for the working poor? One of the best anti-poverty programs we can do. Plus, there's all the self-esteem that comes from working.
Of course.
And so it seems like in terms of making people's lives better, making wages better, drawing all these people out of the labor force back in, tight labor market is the best thing we can do. But immigration is likely going to short circuit that if these people have their way.
10 seconds. Do you think if the majority of immigrants coming to this country voted Republican, that Democrats might renew their interest in a tight labor market?
Yeah, it's true. About 2-to-1 immigrants and their kids are voting Democratic, and maybe that does have an impact. I hope you're wrong about that.
Yeah, maybe.
But that does seem to play some role.
Not to be cynical. I've done too many segments on this. Stephen Camarano, thank you. Really interesting.
Thanks for having me.
San Francisco, probably the most beautiful city in the continental United States, is now coated in human waste and discarded syringes. Is the city finally paying the price for becoming a left-wing dystopia? We'll explore that question next. If you've been there recently, you might consider this impossible, but San Francisco's problem with filth is actually getting worse. Of course, for years, it has been covered with needles and human waste. But this week, residents have been complaining about the stench of a staggering 20-pound bag of feces, human feces, I hate even to say it, but it's real, left on a sidewalk. Finally, the city is paying the price for this chaos. A major medical convention is moving to a different city. They're citing health risks to attendees. Kimberly Brown Peltzer is a longtime actress, and she's now a Republican candidate for California's 36th congressional district, and she joins us tonight. Thank you so much for coming on. You've been in California.
No, thank you for having me.
Well, it's just sad. As someone who loves California, and I know that you do too, having been there an awfully long time. Right. It takes a lot to destroy a city like San Francisco. How did this happen?
You know what, Tucker, I'm third-generation California born and raised, and this is not the California I came from, or you for that matter. I know you're a Southern California boy. But, Prop 47, once that passed, and you could actually steal anything, $950 below, the homeless have been flocking to the state of California.
That was the proposition for our viewers who don't follow it. That was the proposition that made low-level crimes not crimes, basically, anymore.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I can tell you, on a personal level, I have people coming into my stores on a regular basis, stealing items that my employees are later finding on Craigslist, and the police can't do anything about it. They say they won't show up, because where do you send a ticket for someone who's homeless? They simply don't show up any longer. And they've made crime okay in the state of California. And in San Francisco, where you're talking about, I mean, that's Pelosi's backyard.
Yes.
And she is part of that liberal agenda that is driving California down the path that it's going. And Raul Ruiz, who I'm running against, is doing the exact same thing. They don't understand what's happening in California because they want to turn the other way.
Well, and they're totally in their bubbles. I mean, what's interesting is that San Francisco is one of the richest places, not just in the world, but in all of human history. And yet it has the most filth on the sidewalk and the most people living outside. I mean, I find it totally bizarre. Do they not notice it, do you think?
Well, I just don't think that they care. They're trying to attract people to California to keep their voter base popular. And I can tell you, this is not the California that we want any longer. We need change here desperately. My employees every single morning have to go out and clean the feces, the needles. They have to try to get people who are homeless to move. People are afraid to come to businesses any longer in the state of California. And just like you said, as far as conventions coming to California, that's a big industry here. And that's changing as well. They're not paying attention. They're not listening. And they're going to have to here very soon, or we're going to continue down this road.
It took centuries to build that state, and they've wrecked it so fast. Kimberlin, thank you, and good luck in your race. I'm suddenly rooting for you.
Thank you.
That was great. Good to talk to you.
Well, good to see you, Tucker. You take care.
Thank you. Lawmakers in New York just failed to pass a bill banning revenge porn. Advocates say Google is to blame. Interesting story. We've got details coming up. That would have banned so-called revenge porn, that is the posting of naked images online without the consent of the naked. The bill failed to pass, though, and some say Google is to blame for that. After not saying anything about the law for years, supporters say Google demanded numerous changes on the day of the vote. Lawmakers balked, and the bill was not even voted on. Beverly Hallberg is the president of District Media Group, and she joins us tonight. Beverly, do you think Google was behind killing the bill?
I think Google took way too long to voice their concerns. This is a bill that's been in the works for about 5 years. We also have 40 states, including Washington, D.C., that have passed similar legislations. The question is, why so late in the game? I think it's suspect. I think it has something to do with them not wanting to have to be involved. But I do think that there is some validity in us not asking platforms like Google, like Facebook, to have to be the arbitrators of what should be on their platforms and what shouldn't. Of course, there are community guidelines that they need to follow, public decency laws, but do we really want Facebook and Google and others to be the arbitrator of what's consensual, what's not consensual? Because should we really put our free speech rights in their hands?
Well, we've already given them our free speech rights. That's the portal through which all human information flows, and they clamp down on ideas they don't like. I mean, they censor ideas that they don't agree with, and they're liberal. But I think you raise a valid point, actually. The question for me is, to what extent does Google have control over the legislative process? Their lobbying efforts seem so vast, but no one ever reports on it.
Unfortunately, too much. I think it's, like I said, extremely suspect. I'm not sure exactly with these legislators in New York City or in New York State, what is the poll, why so late in the game? But I think there's some cronyism going on. Are they giving funds to these legislators for their campaigns? What is behind it? But again, I think when it comes to big tech, they are to blame for a lot of things. Even recently, I thought the most surprising story about big tech this week was that they said that Facebook, on one of the Facebook outlets, they said that posting of the amendments from the Constitution was actually hate speech. And there was a Texas publication that leading up to July 4th said, we want to post an amendment every day, show people what's in the Bill of Rights. And one of the amendments they said was actually hate speech. They now have unblocked it and put it back on. But once again, why is big tech determining what is hate speech, what is not? And I think that's concerning. And why are they in the pockets, it seems to be at times, with so many elected officials?
Well, that is the question. So you have a company that has more power than any company has ever had in human history over not just what we know, but how we think. And it has a demonstrated history of censorship, political censorship, and our Congress has done nothing about it. I mean, doesn't that by itself almost suggest that they control the Congress to a greater degree than a company should?
And very concerning. I think the other side of this, too, is that when it comes to these platforms, I think government doesn't know how they work. Even when you look at cybersecurity, what happens with the Russians, with Russian bots and Facebook, there's a lot of questions. Does government and our elected officials and the different branches of government, these agencies, do they even understand how this works? Do they even know the type of regulation? So I think in many ways, when you look at our tech innovation, and it's outpacing what our lawmakers are actually able to keep up with. And so what is the answer to it when government officials don't understand? I do like that we have legislators legislation on state level dealing with some of these laws. What we have to get away with are unelected bureaucrats making regulations. But we need more people, I think, involved in figuring out how to protect our privacy that actually understand the technology, because sadly government just doesn't, or they aren't up to speed as they should.
Yeah, or at least elected officials ought to be writing the laws, you know, and not people you never heard of. Beverly Hallberg, thank you very much. Appreciate it. China rolling out new trade restrictions today. They seem intended to have an effect on our next election. A foreign power intervening in our democracy. I'm sure they're on this on the other channels. If not, we are. So we'll be right back with that.